In the rolling hills of Essex County, Tennessee, there stands a testament to prosperity that few dare to question. The Chamberlain Cotton Mill, established in 1863, built a fortune so vast that it funded 3 generations of political power and social influence. But beneath the whitewashed success story lies a darker truth that local historians have spent over a century trying to bury. Between 1863 and 1867, 73 workers simply vanished from the mill's employment records. No resignations, no deaths reported to the county clerk, no forwarding addresses, just names crossed out in black ink as if they had never existed at all. The strange part, every disappearance coincided with record-breaking cotton production. Months, the mill's own ledgers, discovered in a sealed basement vault in 1987, tell a story that the Chamberlain family has fought desperately to keep hidden. What really happened during those 4 blood-soaked years when cotton was king and human life was cheaper than raw material? Before we continue with the story of the Chamberlain Cotton Mill and its vanished workers, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're diving deep into America's darkest historical secrets, and we want you with us for every chilling revelation. Also, drop a comment below and let us know what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the nation. The truth about those 73 souls begins in the winter of 1862, when ambitious young industrialist Jeremiah Chamberlain saw opportunity in the chaos of Civil War. Gallatin, Tennessee in 1862 was a town caught between worlds. Located just 30 miles northeast of Nashville, it had grown prosperous on tobacco farming and river trade along the Cumberland, but as the Civil War raged through its second year, traditional industries crumbled under the weight of blockades, conscription, and economic uncertainty. Confederate currency became worthless paper, and Union occupation forces controlled the vital supply routes that had once made the region wealthy. Into this desperate landscape came Jeremiah Chamberlain, a 28-year-old entrepreneur from Massachusetts with unusual credentials. Unlike other northern businessmen who saw the South as conquered territory to exploit, Chamberlain possessed something far more valuable: detailed knowledge of cotton processing techniques learned during 2 years working in the textile mills of Leela. More importantly, he carried letters of recommendation from Union Army quartermasters who desperately needed reliable suppliers of military uniforms and canvas. Chamberlain was a man of medium height, with steel-gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that gave him an air of authority beyond his years. Those who met him described an almost hypnotic quality to his voice, soft-spoken yet commanding, with the ability to make the most unreasonable requests sound perfectly logical. He dressed impeccably even in wartime, favoring dark wool suits and gold pocket watches that suggested prosperity in times when most men wore patched clothing. The mill he established occupied a prime location along Bledsoe Creek, where the water flow provided consistent power for the massive cotton gins and looms. The 3-story brick building rose like a red fortress from the Tennessee countryside, its tall windows designed to capture maximum daylight for the workers inside. Chamberlain had spared no expense in construction, importing machinery directly from northern manufacturers and hiring skilled foremen from established mills in Georgia and the Carolinas. What made the Chamberlain Cotton Mill unique, however, was its workforce. While other manufacturers struggled to find reliable labor during wartime, Chamberlain seemed to have solved this problem with remarkable efficiency. His mill operated at full capacity throughout 1863, producing military contracts worth over $200,000, an astronomical sum for a rural Tennessee operation. The secret to his success, Chamberlain claimed, lay in his progressive employment policies. He offered higher wages than competing mills, provided on-site housing for workers and their families, and maintained what he called a family atmosphere where employees were treated with dignity and respect. Local newspapers praised his business model as proof that northern capital and southern labor could work together for mutual prosperity. But those who paid closer attention noticed troubling inconsistencies in Chamberlain's operation. Workers seemed to come and go with unusual frequency. Families would arrive to take jobs at the mill, live in the company housing for several months, then simply disappear overnight. When questioned, Chamberlain explained that many of his employees were refugees from the fighting in Middle Tennessee, naturally inclined to move on when they heard news of family or better opportunities elsewhere. The explanation satisfied most local residents who had their own wartime concerns to worry about: food shortages, Confederate raiders, and the constant threat of Union reprisals made everyone focus on daily survival rather than the comminglings and goings at the cotton mill. Besides, Chamberlain's operation brought desperately needed employment and federal money into the community. Questions about his business practices seemed ungrateful, even unpatriotic. Yet, there were those who noticed details that didn't quite add up. Dr. Marcus Henley, the town's only physician, mentioned to his wife that he had never been called to treat a single worker from the Chamberlain mill, despite the dangerous nature of industrial machinery. Sarah Poole Jennings, postmaster and distant relative of former President James K. Polk, observed that mill workers never seemed to send or receive correspondence, unusual for people supposedly maintaining family connections across the war-torn South. Most troubling of all were the observations of 12-year-old Caleb Craraven, whose family farm bordered the mill property. Caleb spent his days hunting rabbits and fishing along Bledsoe Creek, activities that gave him an unobstructed view of the mill's operations. He noticed that while workers regularly entered the mill each morning, he rarely saw the same faces leaving at the end of the day. When he mentioned this to his father, he was told that mill workers probably used a different exit or worked varying shifts. But Timothy's sharp young eyes had caught something else entirely. On several occasions, usually during the darkest hours, before dawn, he had seen wagons leaving the mill grounds, heavily loaded with what appeared to be large bundles wrapped in canvas. The wagons always headed south toward the Cumberland River, and they always returned empty by sunrise. The boy's innocent observations would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. For in the winter of 1863, as Chamberlain's mill reached peak production, and his profits soared to unprecedented heights, the first signs appeared that something far more sinister than cotton processing was taking place within those red brick walls. The first crack in Jeremiah Chamberlain's carefully constructed facade appeared on February 14, 1863, when a blizzard struck Middle Tennessee with unprecedented fury. Snow fell for 3 days straight, accumulating to depths not seen in living memory. Roads became impossible. Telegraph lines snapped under the weight of ice, and even the hardiest residents were forced to remain indoors until the storm passed. For Caleb Craraven, confined to his family's farmhouse, with nothing but books and the view from his bedroom window, the storm provided an unexpected opportunity to observe the mill's operations under extraordinary circumstances. What he witnessed during those 3 days would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the first day of the storm, as wind howled across the frozen landscape and snow piled against the mill's windows, Caleb noticed that lights remained burning throughout the night in the main production floor. This struck him as odd, since most businesses had suspended operations until weather conditions improved. Through his father's spyglass, borrowed without permission, he could see figures moving back and forth past the illuminated windows, suggesting that work continued despite the dangerous conditions. More puzzling was the absence of smoke from the mill's residential quarters. The company housing, a row of neat wooden structures adjacent to the main building, showed no signs of heating fires or chimney smoke. Even in the worst weather, families would be burning whatever fuel they could find to stay warm. The buildings appeared completely lifeless, as if no one lived there at all. On the second night, as the storm reached its peak intensity, Caleb witnessed something that made his blood freeze. Around midnight, during a brief lull in the wind, he saw a line of people, being led from the main mill building toward what appeared to be a storage shed at the rear of the property. Even through the swirling snow, he could see that the figures moved slowly, almost reluctantly, and seemed to be carrying bundles or personal belongings. What disturbed him most was the presence of armed men escorting the group. Caleb counted at least 4 guards, their rifles clearly visible even at a distance. This was no ordinary transfer of workers to different quarters. The entire procession had the feel of prisoners being moved under duress. The boy watched until the group disappeared into the storage building. No one emerged. The guards returned to the main mill, but the shed remained dark and silent for the rest of the night. Caleb waited until dawn, expecting to see the workers return to their duties, but the building remained empty and still. On the 3rd day, as the storm finally began to subside, Caleb observed the most disturbing scene yet. 3 wagons heavily loaded and covered with canvas tarps departed from the mill grounds just before sunrise. Despite the treacherous road conditions, the drivers seemed determined to reach their destination. Whatever the risk, the wagons headed south through the snow-covered fields, following a route that would take them to the Cumberland River. When the wagons returned, several hours later, they were empty, clean, as if they had never carried anything at all. That afternoon, as roads became passable and normal activity resumed throughout the county, Caleb made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. Sneaking onto the mill property while workers were busy clearing snow from the main building, he approached the storage shed where he had seen the group of people disappear 2 nights earlier. The building was empty, completely empty, not just of people, but of any sign that people had ever been there. No personal belongings, no bedding, no evidence of recent habitation. The floor had been swept clean, and the air smelled strongly of lye soap, as if someone had scrubbed away all traces of human presence. But in one corner, partially hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Caleb found something that made his heart race. A small leather shoe, the kind worn by a child. The leather was still supple, the sole barely worn, indicating it had been lost recently. Inside the shoe, carved into the insole with what appeared to be a nail or sharp piece of metal, were the initials "Me" and a date, February 12, 1863. 2 days before the blizzard, 2 days before the mysterious nighttime procession to the storage shed. Caleb clutched the shoe to his chest and ran home through the melting snow, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. He burst into his family's kitchen, where his parents were preparing dinner, breathless and pale with fear. "P," he gasped. Something awful happened at the mill during the storm. There were people and guards and wagons. His father, Thomas Craraven, looked up from his evening paper with mild irritation. "Timothy, how many times have I told you to stay away from that property? Mr. Chamberlain's business is none of our concern." "But P, I found this." Caleb held up the small shoe, his hand trembling. There was a child, and now they're gone, and I think Thomas Craven's expression changed as he examined the shoe. The implications were too disturbing to ignore. A lost child's shoe found in an empty building after a suspicious nighttime gathering suggested possibilities that no father wanted to contemplate. "Where exactly did you find this, son?" Caleb explained everything he had witnessed during the 3-day storm, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to be believed. His mother, Margaret Craraven, grew increasingly pale as the story unfolded. When Caleb finished, the kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Thomas Craraven turned the small shoe over in his calloused hands, studying the carved initials and date. Finally, he looked up at his son with an expression of grim determination. "Timothy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are never to speak of this to anyone outside this family. Not to your friends, not to your teacher, not to anyone in town. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, confused by his father's reaction. "But we have to tell someone, P, if something bad happened to that child, son," Thomas said quietly. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is ask questions. When powerful people don't want them asked. Mr. Chamberlain has friends in very high places. Union Army contracts, government connections, enough money to make problems disappear. Margaret Craraven spoke for the first time since hearing her son's story. What are you saying, Thomas? That we just ignore what Caleb saw? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. I'm saying we need to be very, very careful about what we do next. Because if KBB is right about what he witnessed, then we're dealing with something far worse than just a cotton mill with unusual business practices. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock sounded at the front door. Through the frosted window, they could see the silhouette of a man in a dark overcoat, his breath forming clouds in the cold evening air. It was Jeremiah Chamberlain himself, come calling on his neighbors with a smile that didn't quite reach those steel-gray eyes. The conversation between Thomas Craraven and Jeremiah Chamberlain that February evening lasted barely 10 minutes. But its implications would echo through the decades that followed. Chamberlain had come, he explained, with his characteristic smooth confidence, to discuss a business proposition that would benefit both families. Thomas, Chamberlain began, settling into the Cravens' modest parlor with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere. I've been watching your boy, Timothy. Sharp eyes, that one curious mind, the kind of young man who notices things others might miss. Thomas felt his wife's hand tighten on his arm, a silent warning to proceed with caution. Timothy's always been observant. Thomas replied carefully, sometimes too much so, for his own good. Chamberlain's smile broadened, but his gray eyes remained cold and calculating. Curiosity is a valuable trait in the right circumstances. In others, it can be problematic. I'm here to ensure that Timothy's natural inquisitiveness is channeled in productive directions. From his coat pocket, Chamberlain withdrew a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be legal documents. I'm prepared to offer your family a substantial sum, $500 for a small piece of your land, that strip along Bledsoe Creek where Caleb likes to fish. I need it for mill expansion, water rights, that sort of thing. $500 was more money than the Craraven family had ever seen at one time. In 1863, it represented nearly 3 years' worth of farm income. The offer was so generous as to be almost suspicious. That's very generous, Mr. Chamberlain, Thomas stammered. But that particular piece of land has been in my family for 30 years. It's not really for sale. Chamberlain's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the oil lamps flickered, as if touched by an unfelt breeze. I understand attachment to family land, Thomas. I truly do. But progress waits for no man, and my mill represents the future of this county. The question is whether your family will be part of that prosperous future, or he let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Margaret Craraven found her voice. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Chamberlain? I'm saying that cooperation tends to be rewarded while obstruction can lead to unfortunate circumstances. Take the Henderson family, for instance. They were initially reluctant to sell me the land where my mill now stands. But after young James Henderson had that terrible accident with his hunting rifle, they reconsidered. Amazing how quickly priorities can change when tragedy strikes close to home. The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took a moment for its full meaning to register. James Henderson had indeed died in a hunting accident 6 months earlier, a tragedy that had shocked the community. The idea that it might not have been accidental had never occurred to anyone. Thomas Craraven looked at his 12-year-old son, who sat wide-eyed in the corner, clearly understanding more of the adult conversation than anyone was comfortable with. The choice before him was stark. Accept Chamberlain's offer and ensure his family's safety, or refuse and risk the consequences. I'll need some time to consider your offer, Thomas said finally. Chamberlain rose from his chair with fluid grace, collecting his portfolio and adjusting his gold watch chain. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Thomas," he paused at the door, "do remember that opportunities like this don't come along often, and neither do second chances." After Chamberlain's departure, the Craraven family sat in stunned silence. The implications of the visit were clear, to all three of them. Timothy's observations during the blizzard had somehow reached Chamberlain's attention, and the mill owner was taking steps to ensure that no further questions would be asked. 3 days later, Thomas Craraven signed the papers, selling his creek-eyed property to the Chamberlain Cotton Mill for $500 in gold coin. The transaction was recorded at the county courthouse with unusual speed, processed by a clerk who had recently received a substantial donation to his church building fund. But selling the land didn't end Timothy's interest in the mill's operations. If anything, losing his favorite fishing spot only intensified his curiosity about what Chamberlain was so desperate to hide. The boy began taking longer routes to school. That allowed him to observe the mill from different angles, noting patterns in the comminglings and goings of workers and wagons. What he discovered over the following months painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Workers continued to arrive at the mill in small groups, usually families or individuals who appeared to be refugees from the ongoing war. They would be housed in the company quarters for periods ranging from several weeks to a few months. Then, inevitably, they would simply vanish. The disappearances followed a predictable pattern. They always occurred during periods of peak production, when the mill was working around the clock to fulfill military contracts. They always happened at night, usually during the darkest hours before dawn, and they always coincided with the appearance of those mysterious canvas-covered wagons. Heading south toward the Cumberland River, Cal began keeping a secret journal, recording every observation, in a code of his own devising. He noted names when he could learn them, descriptions of the missing workers, and dates of their disappearances. By the end of 1863, his journal contained references to 27 individuals who had simply vanished from the mill's employment, but it was his discovery in late December that truly revealed the scope of Chamberlain's operation. While exploring the woods near the river, Caleb found what appeared to be a makeshift burial ground. Dozens of crude graves marked only by numbered wooden stakes driven into the frozen earth. The graves were arranged in neat rows, suggesting systematic organization rather than random burial of disease, victims, or war casualties. Most disturbing of all was the freshness of many graves. The earth was recently turned, the wooden markers still new and unstained by weather. Someone had been burying bodies here regularly, probably for months. Caleb counted 73 graves in total. 73 wooden stakes, numbered consecutively representing 73 human beings, who had found their final rest in unmarked graves along the Cumberland River. As he stood among the silent markers, snow beginning to fall once again across the Tennessee landscape, Caleb Craraven realized that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than unusual business practices. He was looking at evidence of systematic murder carried out with industrial efficiency and hidden beneath the respectable facade of wartime manufacturing. The question that would haunt him for the rest of his life was simple. What exactly was Jeremiah Chamberlain doing to those workers that required them to be buried in secret graves? And more importantly, how many more would die before someone found the courage to stop him? The winter of 1863 gave way to a spring that brought both hope and horror to Sumner County. Union forces had secured most of Middle Tennessee. Trade was slowly resuming along the Cumberland River, and there was cautious optimism that the war might be turning in favor of the North. For Jeremiah Chamberlain, these developments meant expanded opportunities and even larger government contracts. But for Caleb Craraven, now 13, and increasingly haunted by his discoveries, spring brought new evidence of the terrible secret hidden within the mill's operations. His clandestine observations had evolved into a systematic investigation driven by a young man's sense of justice and a growing understanding that he might be the only person positioned to expose the truth. The breakthrough came in April, when Caleb witnessed the arrival of a new group of workers. Unlike previous groups, this family included someone Caleb recognized, Rebecca Sutton, the 16-year-old daughter of a Methodist preacher from nearby Hartsville. Rebecca's family had been displaced by Confederate raiders the previous month, and word had spread through local churches that they were seeking employment and shelter. Caleb watched as the Sutton family, parents, 3 daughters, and a young son were welcomed at the mill with Chamberlain's characteristic charm and efficiency. They were assigned to a small house in the workers' quarters, given employment in the mill's production areas, and promised steady wages, plus room and board. To outside observers, it appeared to be an ideal arrangement for a family left destitute by war. But Caleb knew better. Based on his observations of previous patterns, he estimated that the Sutton family had perhaps 2 months before they would join the ranks of the disappeared. The knowledge filled him with a desperate urgency. These weren't anonymous refugees anymore. This was a family he knew, people he had seen at church gatherings and community events. Determined to gather concrete evidence of Chamberlain's crimes, KB began taking extraordinary risks. He started sneaking onto the mill property at night, hiding in haylofts and storage sheds to observe the nighttime activities that seemed to be central to the operation. What he discovered exceeded his worst fears. The mill's basement, accessible through a seldom-used entrance near the creek, contained facilities that had nothing to do with cotton processing. Caleb glimpsed rooms that appeared to be designed for confinement, bare chambers with heavy doors and barred windows. He saw what looked like a medical facility, complete with surgical instruments and bottles of chemicals whose purposes he could only guess at. Most disturbing of all was a room that contained detailed records of every worker who had ever been employed at the mill. Names, ages, physical descriptions, family connections, and most significantly, detailed notes about their usefulness for what Chamberlain termed experimental purposes. The files were organized with meticulous care, suggesting a systematic approach to whatever was happening to the missing workers. Timothy's blood ran cold as he read entries in Chamberlain's own handwriting. Subject 23, John Patterson, age 34, excellent physical condition, suitable for endurance testing, expired after 72 hours. Subject 31, Mary Collins, age 28, previous exposure to typhoid, useful for immunity studies, disposed of after 2 weeks observation. Subject 41, David Reynolds, age 19, strong constitution, ideal for surgical procedures, materials preserved for further study. The clinical language and systematic notation made clear that the mill was serving as cover for medical experiments of the most horrific kind. Chamberlain wasn't simply murdering his workers, he was using them as human test subjects for research that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The realization that Rebecca Sutton and her family were destined for this fate drove Caleb to desperate action. He began leaving anonymous warnings for the Sutton family, slipping notes under their door at night, or hiding messages where Rebecca might find them during her work shifts. The warnings were cryptic. Trust no one at the mill. Leave while you still can. Danger comes with darkness. But he hoped they would plant seeds of suspicion that might save their lives. His efforts seemed to be working. Caleb noticed that Rebecca had become increasingly nervous and watchful. She began asking questions about previous workers, inquiring about families who had supposedly moved on to other opportunities. Her questions made other current workers uncomfortable, and word eventually reached Chamberlain that the newest employees were displaying troubling curiosity about mill operations. The response was swift and ruthless. On the night of June 15, 1864, Caleb watched in horror as armed guards surrounded the Sutton family's quarters. The family was roused from their beds and marched at gunpoint toward the mill's basement facilities. Rebecca's terrified cries echoed across the compound as she was separated from her parents and younger siblings. Caleb knew he was witnessing the beginning of the end for the Sutton family. Within days, they would become subjects in Chamberlain's twisted experiments. Within weeks, they would join the 73 unmarked graves along the Cumberland River. But Rebecca Sutton was different from previous victims. She was young, intelligent, and determined to survive, as Caleb would soon discover. She was also planning something that would either save her family or ensure that their deaths would not go unwitnessed. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Jeremiah Chamberlain's depravity, a 16-year-old girl's courage would illuminate the full horror of what was happening inside that mill. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what Rebecca Sutton did next. Hidden in the basement of the mill, Rebecca had discovered something that even Timothy's investigations had missed. A detailed journal kept by Chamberlain himself, documenting every experiment, every death, and most importantly, every financial transaction connected to his research. The mill wasn't just a cover for medical experiments. It was part of a larger network, providing human subjects to wealthy physicians and researchers throughout the South. Men willing to pay enormous sums for opportunities to conduct studies impossible in legitimate medical settings. The journal revealed that Chamberlain's operation was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. He had established similar facilities in Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina, all disguised as wartime manufacturing operations. The network had processed over 400 subjects in 2 years, generating profits that dwarfed even the substantial income from legitimate cotton production. But the journal also contained information that would prove to be Chamberlain's downfall. It included names, dates, and locations of transactions with prominent physicians and government officials. It detailed payoffs to local authorities and threats made against potential witnesses. Most damaging of all, it contained correspondence with Union Army medical officers who were purchasing experimental data derived from Chamberlain's human subjects. Rebecca managed to tear out several crucial pages from the journal and hide them in her clothing before being discovered by guards. She knew that the evidence she carried might be the only hope of exposing the truth about what was happening at the mill. But first, she would have to survive long enough to get the information to someone who could act on it. What she didn't know was that Caleb Craraven had been watching from outside the basement window, and that he had seen her conceal the stolen pages. The two young people, separated by bars and guards, but united in their determination to stop Chamberlain's crimes, were about to form the most unlikely partnership in the history of Sumner County. A partnership that would either save dozens of lives or cost them their own. The final phase of Jeremiah Chamberlain's operation began on a sweltering July morning in 1864, when a telegram arrived from Union Army headquarters in Nashville. The message was brief, but devastating to Chamberlain's plans. Effective immediately, all civilian medical research contracts were being reviewed by a new oversight committee, and any facilities conducting experimental work on human subjects must be registered and inspected within 30 days. Caleb Craraven, hidden in his usual observation post in the mill's heft, watched as Chamberlain read the telegram. The mill owner's face went through a remarkable transformation from confident authority to barely controlled rage to cold, calculating determination. Whatever the telegram contained, it had fundamentally changed the situation at the mill. Within hours, Chamberlain had called a meeting of his inner circle, Dr. Marcus Hensley, who Caleb now realized was not the town physician, but a medical researcher working with Chamberlain, Foreman William Garrett, and 3 armed guards who served as enforcers. The meeting took place in Chamberlain's private office, but Caleb had discovered that voices carried clearly through the building's ventilation system to his hiding place in the loft. "Gentlemen," Chamberlain's voice was controlled but tense. "We have 30 days to conclude our current research and eliminate all evidence of our activities. The Oversight Committee includes several individuals who would not be sympathetic to our work regardless of its scientific value. Dr. Hensley's response was immediate and panicked. 30 days. Jeremiah, we have 47 active subjects in various stages of study. Some experiments have been running for months. We can't simply. We can, and we will. Chamberlain cut him off. Every subject currently in the facility will be processed to completion within the next 2 weeks. All records will be destroyed. All physical evidence will be eliminated. By the time any inspectors arrive, they will find nothing more than a patriotic cotton mill contributing to the Union war effort. Timothy's blood chilled as he grasped the implications. 47 people were being held in the mill's basement facilities, and Chamberlain was planning to murder them all within 2 weeks to cover up his crimes. Among those 47 were Rebecca Sutton and her family. But even more horrifying was what came next in the conversation. What about witnesses? This was William Garrett, the foreman whose job was handling the practical aspects of the operation. The Craraven boy has been sniffing around for over a year. The postmaster's been asking questions about mail delivery to workers who supposedly moved on. Doc Peterson in town mentioned he's never treated any mill injuries despite all the dangerous machinery. I'm aware of the potential problems, Chamberlain replied smoothly. I've already taken steps to address the most significant threats. The Craraven family will be invited to join our workforce within the next few days. A generous offer of employment that they won't be able to refuse. As for the others, well, accidents happen during wartime. House fires, hunting mishaps, falls from horses. Tragic, but understandable. Caleb realized with crystal clarity that his entire family was now marked for death. Chamberlain had tolerated their knowledge as long as it could be managed through bribes and threats. But with the Oversight Committee investigation looming, all potential witnesses had become liabilities to be eliminated. The boy's mind raced as he considered his options. He could run home and warn his parents, but where would they go? Chamberlain had connections throughout Middle Tennessee, and fleeing would only confirm their guilt in his eyes. He could try to contact Union authorities, but the nearest garrison was in Nashville, a day's ride away, and he had no proof that anyone would believe. The only chance was to coordinate with Rebecca Sutton and the other prisoners to expose the truth before Chamberlain could implement his final solution, but that would require getting into the basement facilities past armed guards and organizing a coordinated escape attempt with people who had been weakened by weeks or months of captivity. Caleb made his decision. That night, he would attempt the most dangerous infiltration of his young life, seeking to reach the basement prisoners and organize a rebellion that would either free them all or ensure that someone survived to tell the truth about what had happened at the Chamberlain Cotton Mill. As he prepared to descend from his hiding place, Caleb overheard one final exchange that made his mission even more urgent. "When do we begin the final processing?" Dr. Hensley asked. "Tonight," Chamberlain replied. "We'll start with the children. They require less preparation, and their elimination will encourage cooperation from the adult subjects. By morning, we should be able to reduce our numbers by at least a dozen." Timothy's hands shook as he climbed down from the loft. Rebecca's 8-year-old brother would be among the first to die unless something was done immediately. The boy who had spent over a year observing and recording Chamberlain's crimes was about to discover whether his courage was equal to the task of stopping them. The basement of the mill after midnight was a place that existed beyond nightmares. As Caleb crept through corridors lit only by flickering oil lamps, he encountered sights that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Cells containing gaunt figures who barely looked human anymore. Operating rooms stained with evidence of procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. Storage areas filled with jars containing specimens that had once been parts of living people. But it was in the final corridor that Caleb found what he was looking for. Rebecca Sutton, still alive, still defiant, and still clutching the stolen journal pages that could expose Chamberlain's entire operation. When she saw Timothy's face at her cell window, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperate determination. "Timothy," she whispered, "thank God. I thought no one knew we were here." "I know everything," Caleb replied softly, "and I'm going to get you out, but we have to move fast. They're planning to kill all of you tonight, starting with the children." Rebecca's face hardened with resolve. "Then we don't have time for a careful escape. We're going to have to fight our way out, and some of us probably won't make it." As Caleb worked to pick the lock on Rebecca's cell with tools stolen from the mill's maintenance shop. Both young people understood that they were embarking on a mission that would either save dozens of lives or cost them their own. But they also knew that they were the only hope for justice for the 73 people already buried in unmarked graves along the Cumberland River. The rebellion was about to begin. The uprising at the Chamberlain Cotton Mill began at 2:47 a.m. on July 22, 1864, when Caleb Craraven and Rebecca Sutton unlocked the first cell door and whispered the words that would change everything. "We're getting out of here, all of us, tonight." The prisoners they freed were in various stages of physical and mental deterioration. But Rebecca's stolen journal pages had revealed something that transformed their despair into fury. Chamberlain's records showed that none of them were random victims. They had been specifically selected based on detailed profiles. Families with no local connections, individuals fleeing war zones who wouldn't be missed, people whose disappearances could be explained away as voluntary departures. But more importantly, the records revealed that several prisoners had family members in positions of authority. Rebecca's uncle was a federal judge in Kentucky. Another prisoner's brother was a Union Army colonel. A third victim's father was a wealthy merchant with connections to northern textile interests. Chamberlain had been playing a dangerous game, and his systematic documentation of every detail would provide the evidence needed to destroy him. The escape plan was desperate, but simple. Rebecca would lead a group through the mill's basement toward the creekside exit, while Caleb created a diversion at the main building to draw away the guards. The freed prisoners would make their way to the county seat, where Rebecca's stolen documents could be presented to federal authorities. What none of them anticipated was the presence of Dr. Hensley in the basement at that exact moment, conducting what he called preliminary preparations on the youngest prisoners. The physician's scream of alarm echoed through the corridors as he stumbled upon Caleb freeing the last group of captives. "Guards, guards, the subjects are escaping." The basement erupted into chaos. Armed men thundered down the stairs while prisoners scattered in every direction through the maze of corridors. Caleb found himself separated from Rebecca as gunshots rang out in the narrow spaces, the sound deafening in the confined underground chambers. But Rebecca Sutton had not survived weeks of captivity, only to be recaptured at the moment of freedom. Clutching Chamberlain's incriminating journal pages, she led her group of freed prisoners through a route she had memorized during her imprisonment, past the surgical rooms, through the specimen storage areas, toward what she hoped was the creek side exit Caleb had described. Behind them, they could hear Chamberlain's voice, cold and commanding, even in crisis. "Seal the exits. No one leaves this facility alive. Dr. Hensley begin immediate termination of all remaining subjects. We cannot afford witnesses." The race through the basement became a nightmarish game of life and death. Prisoners who had been weakened by weeks of medical experiments now found reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Mothers carried children who could barely walk. Men who had been subjected to surgical procedures helped others navigate corridors slick with spillage from overturned chemical containers. Timothy, separated from the main group, found himself face to face with William Garrett in a storage room, filled with the mill's most damning evidence. Shelves lined with jars containing preserved organs, detailed sketches of surgical procedures, and boxes of correspondence with physicians throughout the Confederacy who had purchased Chamberlain's research data. "You should have minded your own business, boy," Garrett snarled, raising his rifle. But Caleb had spent over a year preparing for this moment. From his hiding place behind a cabinet of specimens, he threw a jar of chemical preservative directly at the oil lamp, illuminating the room. The glass shattered, the lamp fell, and suddenly the storage area was engulfed in flames that spread with terrifying speed through the chemical-soaked environment. The fire created the diversion Caleb had hoped for, but it also transformed the escape into a race against time. The basement, filled with flammable chemicals and wooden support structures, became an inferno that threatened to trap everyone inside, prisoners and captors alike. Rebecca's group reached the creekside exit just as smoke began pouring through the basement corridors, but their escape route was blocked by 2 guards who had anticipated their destination. With the fire spreading behind them and armed men ahead, the situation seemed hopeless. It was 8-year-old Benjamin Sutton, Rebecca's little brother, who provided the solution. The boy had noticed something the adults had missed: a drainage tunnel that connected the basement to Bledsoe Creek, probably installed during the mill's construction to prevent flooding. The tunnel was narrow, partially filled with water, and designed for drainage rather than human passage, but it offered their only hope of escape. One by one, the prisoners crawled through the tunnel as smoke and flames spread through the basement behind them. Rebecca went last, clutching the stolen journal pages in a waterproof pouch she had improvised from oiled cloth found in the storage areas. They emerged from the tunnel into the pre-dawn darkness along Bledsoe Creek, gasping and choking but alive. Behind them, the Chamberlain Cotton Mill was becoming a pillar of fire, visible for miles across the Tennessee countryside. The flames had spread from the basement to the main building, consuming not just the structure, but all the evidence of Chamberlain's crimes, or so it seemed. Caleb Craraven emerged from the burning building 15 minutes later, having fought his way through smoke-filled corridors to reach safety. But he wasn't empty-handed. Tucked inside his jacket were 2 items that would prove crucial: personal ledger, which contained financial records of the entire operation, and a metal strongbox containing correspondence with Union Army medical officers who had been purchasing experimental data. As the survivors gathered along the creek bank, watching the mill burn against the morning sky, they realized they had not just escaped, they had struck a devastating blow against Chamberlain's operation. The fire had destroyed the facilities, freed the remaining prisoners, and eliminated the infrastructure that had made the systematic murders possible. But Jeremiah Chamberlain himself was nowhere to be seen. As sirens and shouts echoed across the countryside as neighbors rushed toward the burning mill and federal authorities were summoned from Nashville, the man responsible for 73 murders had simply vanished into the chaos of the night. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple: where had he gone, and would he attempt to rebuild his operation elsewhere? The answer would not come for 23 years, when construction workers breaking ground for a new courthouse in Gallatin would make a discovery that revealed the final chapter of Jeremiah Chamberlain's story. The immediate aftermath of the mill fire brought justice with surprising swiftness. Rebecca Sutton's stolen journal pages, combined with Caleb Craraven's rescued ledger and the testimony of 37 freed prisoners, provided overwhelming evidence of the systematic murders that had taken place beneath the respectable facade of cotton production. Federal investigators arrived from Nashville within 48 hours, led by Colonel James Mitchell, whose own brother had been among Chamberlain's victims. The scope of the operation shocked even experienced military prosecutors. Dr. Hensley, captured while attempting to flee the burning building, provided detailed testimony in exchange for avoiding execution. His revelations expanded the investigation beyond Tennessee to include similar facilities in Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina. The financial records Caleb had saved proved that Chamberlain's network had generated over $2 million in profit from the sale of experimental data and preserved specimens to physicians throughout the South. Prominent doctors in Charleston, Atlanta, and New Orleans were arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder to violation of medical ethics. Several Union Army medical officers were court-martialed for purchasing research derived from human experimentation. But Jeremiah Chamberlain himself remained a ghost, despite extensive searches and substantial rewards offered for information leading to his capture. The mill owner had vanished completely. Some believed he had fled to Europe, where his wealth could purchase safety and anonymity. Others suspected he had assumed a new identity somewhere in the war-torn South, perhaps establishing another operation under a different name. The 73 unmarked graves along the Cumberland River were exhumed, and the victims given proper burial in the Gallatin City Cemetery. A monument was erected bearing their names recovered from Chamberlain's meticulous records, along with the inscription in memory of those who died in the pursuit of evil disguised as progress. May their suffering never be forgotten. Caleb Craraven became something of a local hero, though he never seemed comfortable with the attention. He testified at numerous trials, helping to convict not just the direct participants in Chamberlain's operation, but also the suppliers, customers, and officials who had enabled the crimes. His detailed observations and careful record-keeping proved crucial in establishing the full scope of the conspiracy. Rebecca Sutton recovered from her ordeal and became a vocal advocate for medical ethics and patient rights. She testified before Congress about the need for oversight of medical research, contributing to legislation that established federal guidelines for human experimentation. Her courage in stealing and preserving Chamberlain's journal pages was credited with saving dozens of lives and exposing a criminal network that spanned multiple states. For 23 years, it seemed that Jeremiah Chamberlain had successfully escaped justice. The investigation gradually wound down. Other priorities claimed official attention, and the mill fire became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical research during wartime. Then, in 1887, construction workers breaking ground for a new courthouse in Gallatin made a discovery that provided the final piece of the puzzle. Buried beneath what had once been the mill's administrative offices, they found a hidden chamber containing the preserved body of a man in his 50s, dressed in expensive clothing and surrounded by gold coins, legal documents, and personal effects that identified him as Jeremiah Chamberlain. The condition of the body and the arrangement of the chamber suggested that Chamberlain had not died in the mill fire, but had been murdered shortly before it began. Medical examination revealed that he had been killed by a single gunshot to the head fired at close range by someone he trusted enough to turn his back on. Among the documents found with the body was a letter in Chamberlain's handwriting, apparently written in his final moments to whoever discovers this record. I have been betrayed by those who profited from my work. Dr. Hensley and Colonel Morrison have decided that my knowledge makes me liability now that federal investigation threatens our operation. They believe that my death will end the inquiry and protect their own involvement. They are wrong. The evidence I have hidden will ensure that justice follows them wherever they flee. Let this be a warning to all who would trade human life for profit. The dead have longer memories than the living.